Our special guests this afternoon are Mrs. Carla-Anne Roper, attorney at law, and who helped prepare a document that would have been shared with you earlier, as well as Mr. Conrad George, who is also an attorney and who also helped to prepare that document. Without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to the president of the Jamaica Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Distant, to start officially.
Remember, it's Lloyd Crowley, and we can just make it easy.
Yes, Lloyd.
Afternoon, Chloe. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, or this evening, actually. It's after 6. For us to have a discourse, a conversation around the document that would have been circulated to provide some guidance on workplace protocols and measures in relation to COVID-19. It would have come about at a time that we'd have had some quite extensive discussions and conversations, primarily around, I'm going to use the term mandating vaccination. Right? So a lot of it came from that discourse that was taking place across not just Jamaica, but across the Caribbean and the world, in fact. I think, like ourselves, many of you would have seen many positions and statements made by erstwhile counsel, not necessarily Conrad and Carla, but this erstwhile counsel internationally, positing positions on what may or may not be done. About a month ago, the private sector organizations, the JEF, PSOJ, JMEA, and the JCC would have met with the union leadership and had a heart-to-heart and a heartfelt conversation around what is most important. And what I would say is, across the piece, all of us were very consistent in our views that vaccinations and encouraging vaccination in the workplace and across the island was most important. We were of the view that it wasn't quite time to put a mandatory policy, certainly a national mandatory policy in place. We need to start working towards it. So certainly we encourage the government and we encourage our lawmakers to begin either looking at OSHA or other relevant legislation to start looking at the likelihood that there may be a time that the government may need to move to allowing and enabling employers to put policy in place to mandate vaccination. But our conversation was much broader. Our conversation was about policies in general and the after effect of policies most importantly. So as employers, we are absolutely mandated to do what is right to protect our business and to protect our employees and of course the public, the customers that we serve. To take it a step further, however, we do recognize that as policies or as workplace policies are not followed, it may become necessary to take stronger disciplinary action. The heart of this is embedded in the discourse that takes place between employers and employees. So the conversations and consultations that ought to take place and that we encourage. But if those conversations do not get to the end result that's important for protecting employees, employers, and businesses, then what are the next steps? We would have engaged, not formally, but certainly Conrad and Carla would have worked with us to present and provide some guidance in these areas. And this would have been signed off by not only ourselves, but the unions as well as being an appropriate guidance to provide for employers. So I use that to provide context. What we want to do is provide you, our businesses, our members, with some guidance in relation to how you ought to be looking at establishing policies and measures to protect your workplace. I'm going to pause there. I'm going to ask Conrad. I'm not sure if Conrad or Carla is going to go first. I believe Conrad is going to go first. Just to provide a quick summary context of what it is that was in the document, the rationale behind the points that were made, and to provide an opportunity to provide that clarity to yourselves. On the back end of that, I believe we may have one entity, one company that we'll ask to speak a little bit about their experience, and then we'll open ourselves up for questions and answers. So without holding us up much more, I'm going to turn over to Conrad and Carla to sort of walk us through what would have been templated and put on the table. Conrad, please.
Thanks, Lloyd. If I can perhaps start out by picking up on something that Lloyd said, which was that initially the discussion was about mandating vaccines, and in opposition to that, various people saying that there is no right in law to mandate vaccines. And what we've sought to do here is to shift the narrative and to set out in the protocol what in fact the legal position is, the various legal positions, the obligations of employers, their rights and duties, the obligations of employees, their rights and duties, and the application of the legal principles to those individuals. The overall position is that you cannot mandate anything. There is no one size fits all, as the law treats with every set of circumstances individually. So although the end result may well be the same as a mandated vaccination program, it is not possible legally to go straight to mandates. One has, as an employer, one has to look at all of the facts, all of the issues, listen to what the employee has to say, and eventually, if there can be no accord, then a compulsory instruction may be given and the employee's employment may be terminated, if in all the circumstances it is reasonable to do so. So it's a bit of a process, but it's a fair process, and it involves the application of the existing legal principles to the workplace in each set of circumstances. So having said that, if I can turn to the document briefly, you will see that at the beginning, the background is set out as being the received medical position, which is basically that the pandemic is very serious, that in particular the Delta variant is highly transmissible and people are dying as a result of having caught it. Despite the government's mandated policies under the DRM, mask wearing, sanitization, social distancing, etc., there is still a dramatic increase in the number of cases to an unacceptable level. And so it is extremely important that employers consider what they do in their workplaces. Moving straight from the obvious threats, the most important thing really is to have a look at the legal duties owed by employers to their employees and to other members of the public. Every employer has a duty to provide a safe system of work to each of his employees, and similar duties to members of the public, visitors to his premises, customers, etc. If an employer fails to do all that is reasonably necessary to keep his workplace safe, he may be sued by somebody who has got sick or has been injured as a result of that and can prove that it was caused by that failure on the part of the employer. There is a corresponding duty, if you go a little bit further on in the document, there are corresponding duties owed by employees. Employees owe a duty of good faith and fidelity implied into every contract of employment in Jamaica. Such a duty is owed to every employer. That duty means, in simple language, that the employee cannot unreasonably cause the employer to be at risk of higher liability. So if the employee is working in close proximity to other employees, and that employee does not observe whatever is necessary to stop the transmission of the virus, and that employee causes another employee or a customer to get ill, the employer is liable, but the employee is also liable to the employer for having caused it. So there are corresponding duties between employer and employee, the result of which is that the employee must respond favorably to reasonable requests by the employer to take reasonable precautions. That's the common law position. Now, on top of the common law position is the statutory position, which is that an employer must not dismiss an employee without all the circumstances making it reasonable for them to do so. the technical language in the statute is unjustifiable, and the courts have held that unjustifiable means unfair or unreasonable in all the circumstances. Now, I think I should perhaps pause there to mention the fact that this is an objective test. Reasonable in all the circumstances means just that. It doesn't mean that I, as an employer, have formed the view that vaccination is vital, and I therefore issue an edict that everybody in my factory or my place of business needs to be vaccinated. That, I'm afraid, is not what the law says, and were I to do so, I could well end up at the Industrial Disputes Tribunal with an unjustifiable dismissal award against me if I carried it through. What the law requires is for the employer to act in a manner that is reasonable in all the circumstances, therefore having taken into account all the circumstances. And that reasonableness will be judged on the basis of objective criteria, not on merely the belief of the employer that X or Y needs to be the case. So in order for this, in practical terms, to be properly implemented, employers need to follow procedures in implementing their policies at the workplace. So for instance, if the employer comes to the conclusion that their employees, his employees work closely together, there is a risk of transmission, they need to be vaccinated, and frankly, this will be the case in most places, the employer cannot just immediately then jump to the state of instructing everybody to be vaccinated. The employer has to go through the process of discussing it with each employee or class of employees, making it clear why the employer feels there ought to be vaccination, and hearing whatever objections there may be, using persuasion, education, whatever measures are appropriate in the circumstances. So that really has regard to the rest of that sort of middle section of the protocol. And we then get to the steps that are recommended for an employer to go through. And that is on page 3, steps 1 to 5, I think, or 1 to 5, really identifies what discussions, consultations, and approaches the employer should undertake. And if at the end of all of that, there is still a disconnect and the employer cannot persuade certain employees to comply with reasonable instructions, then the protocol acknowledges that the employer is then entitled to move towards dismissal. And I should say that the objective really is not for anybody to be dismissed. The hope is that the stages set out in the protocol, the detail with which these are described, will enable the parties to find common ground and not be a dismissal in each case. I should mention in passing that, emphasize really, that the alternatives to vaccination may be very, very limited, but they may exist. Some people may be able to work from home for the rest of the pandemic. Some people may, for other reasons, be able to avoid situations where they can pass the virus to others. And these need to be looked at, because a failure to look at them, even for the purpose of box ticking, can cause the employer, if subsequently the employer needs to dismiss somebody, can cause the employer to be liable for unjustifiable dismissal. And then the overall point, which is a practical one as opposed to a legal one, everything must be very, very carefully documented at each step of the way, because it is not uncommon for parties to reach the Industrial Disputes Tribunal and for there to be an absolute disconnect as to what actually was done by the employer. And an employer who follows the correct procedures really ought to be entitled to rely upon those procedures at the tribunal. And the only way to be sure of that is to make sure they're documented. Unless there's anything else I should have mentioned, that's, I think, my brief summary of what the protocol says.
Okay. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Conrad. Carla, over to you.
Well, I think Conrad has succinctly pointed us to the particular areas that we believe are very important. But I want us to continue along that practical line in terms of why it is that it is important that we take a measured approach in dealing with this matter, so that when we get to the point of having to, if required, take a position, then you can show just how far and how comprehensive the actions taken by the employer has been to assist the employer in being able to fully defend against any claims. So some of the things that you really have to contemplate is that it's important that you take the time. And I believe that's part of the big challenge that faces many employers, especially those that have a large number of employees, to actually have to take this time to individually find out or to work through with employees. Because simply put, ladies and gentlemen, you may have circumstances where an employee has a legitimate reason why the position that is likely to be taken is not compatible with their personal circumstances. So you may have persons who have a medical condition that, based on their doctor's instructions or guidelines, it is not in their interest at the time to be vaccinated. That is something that will, unless that person comes forward voluntarily, you may never know unless you take the time to interrogate and investigate what is occurring. Also, you need to look at the type of work that this employee is doing. If it is a type of work that is compatible with flexible work arrangements or work from home, or they can find some other alternatives to do what it is that they were contracted to do, that reduces appreciably the risk that they may pose to others and themselves, then it is important that an employer look at these and to see if there are workable alternatives for their business. The truth is, it may be difficult and hard because you have a business to run, but the lack of doing that may be what exposes the business, and you will spend a disproportionate amount of time thereafter trying to work through what could have been a simple enough process, even though it may be time consuming. Another thing you have to look at, ladies and gentlemen, is vaccine availability. Right? We can't be blind to what is happening worldwide. Even the WHO head is bemoaning the fact that you have richer countries that are holding on to vaccines, people looking at third doses and so on. And for as much as our government has made extraordinary steps to procure vaccines, at this time, we really still are working in a place, in a circumstance where persons cannot just walk out on the road and say, I would like a vaccine. There's not universal availability. And you also have, and I think Conrad may or may not agree with me, some persons getting very antsy because if and when they do get to that point of making, the decision, we have situations like what we are faced with now, that persons have gone out, taken a first dose, and are now being told, listen, you can't have, we don't have some of the vaccines available. So you have to contemplate that unless you as an employer have a direct line and can ensure and make sure that your employee can get this vaccine when you tell them to, that in and of itself is a militating factor against taking a knee-jerk approach in terms of making a mandating, right? Now, another very important point, Conrad touched on it, and I guess this is just for reinforcement. At this time, the Disaster Risk Management Act has various protocols that are mandated already. Social distancing, sanitizing, hand washing, mask wearing. And the truth is, Conrad, if I'm not mistaken, the Disaster Risk Management Act had some deficiencies in terms of enforcement mechanisms, and Parliament went back and reviewed that so that there are consequences for not doing those things. Many people find that it's too difficult to police something like that. And so they turn their attention to vaccination. Vaccination in and of itself does not, and let me repeat in my own way, does not absolve the employer from ensuring that all those other things remain. Because the science tells us that you can get breakthrough infections, and persons who are fully vaccinated can have the virus and spread the virus. So the fact that every 100% persons are there in your organization or close to it as possible may be vaccinated does not mean that that gives you a get out of jail free card. Because it's possible that there are fully vaccinated persons who may very well also very unlikely, but it's possible, as according to the science, may get very ill. So until it is that we are able to get to that place, you have to also, in my own view, have to be very, very firm in respect of the other modalities that have been used to cauterize the spread of the virus, which even with vaccinations must continue to be in place. And those are protocols that have been put in, and even the latest DRM order still has it there. And so you should not ignore that in terms of when you're looking at the total package of working through this whole issue of vaccinations, right? Now, just today, I shared with Conrad, what do we call this now, Conrad? An opinion coming from the Jamaica Bar Association's Constitutional and Human Rights Committee in terms of a position relating to mandatory vaccinations against COVID. And they had a few pages there in respect of the employer and employee situation. And to a large degree, it accords with the draft protocols that have been sent out for the guidance of employers in terms of, how it is that you should operate within the current legal framework, which has not changed. I suspect, Conrad, when we get to talking, that you may find some information or some questions being asked as it relates to persons who may be over the age of 60 and who are not fully vaccinated. And that, to me, does create some challenges. But in fact, there are the protocols, the DRM does speak to how it is that you ought to be looking at those persons, right? And so the legal opinion from the JAMBAR basically is saying that in certain occupations, based on the level of risk that would be related to their continued working, there may be a case, and a viable case, for mandatory vaccination for persons in hospitals, nursing homes, persons possibly working within the hotel industry, for example, right? And that may affect whether or not the employers can effectively discharge their health and safety duties that Conrad so eloquently pointed us to earlier. And I want to read what they said at paragraph 81 of their opinion. And it says, we would therefore suggest that if an employer wishes to impose a mandatory vaccination scheme, but does not wish to run afoul of any constitutional provisions, they must first undertake a detailed risk assessment to ascertain whether the vaccination is necessary in addition to strict compliance with any COVID guidelines already in place, and the employer should regularly review the vaccination requirement. I mean, I think it goes right back to that document. So we're talking practicalities here. Many organizations may feel that this is a disproportionate type of action to be taken. It's costly, it's time consuming, and really, I don't have the time to do it. Well, don't have the time to do it, ladies and gentlemen, and you will have the time to consult persons like myself and Conrad and others along our class in due course. And we will most certainly try to help you. But you have the opportunity at this point to help yourself and your team. You have many people within your teams, I'm sure, that if you were to sit down with them in a non-confrontational, regular chat with them and interrogate why it is that they hold a position, they will say to you that, when you walk through with them, they don't really have a reason, or the reason they have does not stand up to scrutiny. I'm sure maybe the case study that is coming up will even point us to how that works. But if we do not, quite separate and apart from all of whether or not you're open to legal liability and so on, you have non-tangible costs to your business. And for me, in my experience, those are things that I will never discount. If you put in policies that make people feel as though they have to do something to keep their jobs, or they feel they're under duress, they may very well do it, and it may very well be for their own good. But you may have really disaffected persons, and you can find other knock-on effects continuing your business, and you may not even recognize what's the genesis of it. So at the end of the day, you have dollars and cents, and you have human capital, and you have this COVID pandemic overhead like a cloud. And all of that has to be taken into account when you make the steps that you are making. My recommendation, invest in taking the time now to do what you have to do, so that if on the unlikely event that you have to take other measures, which I'm sure you do not necessarily want to, you will do so with a clear conscience and on the right side of the law to be able to defend yourself successfully. That's my take on it.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I just add that I found the opinion from our colleague Carleen Laumann QC, who is the chairman of the Constitutional Committee, and the rest of the committee, a very, very useful opinion. It supports us down the line. And I would add that Professor Antoine from the university has recently done an opinion that supports the position which we've taken in the protocol also. So from a legal point of view, I think that the predominant views of those that we have high regard for are entirely in keeping with the views that Carla and I have advised the PSOJ on, and which are in the protocol.
Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Carla. I see a lot of questions popping up in the chat, and Cloleen is going to come and guide us through the Q&A session. There's two things before we get there, though. One, just need to apologize for those of you who were not able to get on earlier. We did have some technical challenges in terms of ensuring we're able to get everybody on the chat. So it does look like everybody else is getting onto the session now. So apologies for those of you who are trying to get on earlier and weren't able to join. But we have the opportunity for further discourse and for your questions to be answered. But before Colleen comes on and takes over that piece of it for us, we thought it would be a nice little mix to have feedback from one organization that has, or some insights from one organization that has put in some protocols and measures themselves. I see Glenn Christian on, and Glenn, I just want to give you a couple minutes to share what was the driving thought process, and what is it that drove your organization to put some protocols in place, and anything else you want to share very briefly, so we can get on with the Q&A session. So Glenn, if you'd like to open up and pass a few comments.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we're hearing you.
Yes. For me, this is about lives and livelihood. And after waiting and waiting and waiting and, don't see anything coming forward, everything is at risk. I am at risk, and the vaccinated people are at risk. So what I decided to do was to go on a campaign. And my campaign took the form of speaking to all members of staff from floor to floor, from company to company. I took along with me a doctor from KPH who is well exposed to what is happening down there. And what we did was to allow the staff to ask the questions, all the questions. When we were heading on the campaign, only 30% of our staff was vaccinated. After that, we had a blitz last Monday. And what we found is that after the blitz, with the staff and their family, right in our company now as we speak, up to yesterday, was 67% have been vaccinated. So yet before I set out the policy, which I launched yesterday, again, I brought back the doctor. We fielded the questions, and there were 30 questions, probably valid, or some of them not so valid. But the doctor was again there to speak to them. And today, again, what I did is to walk my warehouses, walk the 4 companies, touching backs, just like a politician. And the feedback I'm getting from managers, they believe by Monday, by next week, we should be in the 90s. All I'm saying is that, look, I think we have to get off the fence. We have our economy to protect. We have our vaccinated staff to protect. I think I came on late, so I didn't hear the legal opinion. But I'm a risk taker, I'm a risk taker. And right now, I believe I have, probably at this moment, we might have 75%. And I'm not going to put this 75% at risk. So I take that decision. I believe that what I would ask CEOs and chair people to do, meet with the people. They want to ask questions. Okay? They have questions, and we need to get to them. Yesterday, what I did, before I launched this, we had a Zoom, and I asked everybody to come on at 8 o'clock in the morning. And we had over 600 and odd, right? Listening. And so it has been working. Okay, just speaking to them. In the company right now, I have managers are wearing shirts, promoting the job. It's for you, for me, for all. Don't hesitate, vaccinate. All our managers are wearing them on the floor right now. So I have taken the way that the political the politicians would hit the road. And speaking to my people that way, and it is working in that way. So, but we have to have a cutoff period. And what I did, this will take effect on the 4th. I've given them 2 weeks. I'm not telling anybody that they must vaccinate. I'm not telling anybody that I'm dismissing them. I just say that you take the PCR test every 2 weeks and to make sure that you are negative. If you are positive, then you can't come. And then we are going to have another blitz sometime in November to support. So I'm using the carrot and the I don't want to say stick, right? But I see this as something that you have to communicate. Everybody must know where they stand and what kind of culture they have in their organization. I have to go to my lunchroom. I eat in my lunchroom. I have about 4 lunchrooms and I eat in them almost every week I walk through. And I walk, I'm a management by walkabout, and that's my approach. So that's how I do it.
Okay.
I put it out there. I shared it with all my colleagues, the distributors, and everybody. I saw us in the newspaper today. It's in the paper today, outlining everything. I'm comfortable with what I've done.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think
Glenn.
what Glenn has outlined there, he didn't actually hear the legal opinion, but the legal opinion very much is, and the steps are set out clearly in the protocol. That is precisely how the exercise should be conducted. The exercise should be one of persuasion and advice and provision of information and answering of questions, but then it moves on. If that is not fully satisfactory, then an employer is not stuck in a situation where he can't move forward. There are provisions in the protocol which are in line with the law that enable an employer, if necessary, to take steps after that. But I commend Glenn, and I'm sure he will reach the 90s. Another client of mine reached 98% today, doing precisely what Mr. Christian has been doing. So I think it can work. It will take time, but as Carla pointed out, the more time you take at this stage, the less time you're likely to be spending in industrial disputes tribunal at a later stage.
Which is one of the underlying reasons of the guidance that was put out there. So Glenn, so thank you for that, Conrad. Glenn, thank you so much for sharing. When we're going through this discourse, one of the comments David won, and I saw David won from the JEF on, was certainly one of the things that he was really pushing is the importance of the discourse and the conversations being leader-led. And you're very much, it's very clear from your example, Glenn, that that's what you're doing. The leadership of the organization driving this, an all-encompassing program of engaging and having discourse with the employees or with your team members so that a conversation can take place. Discussions can help to get the vaccine hesitant over their hesitancy. And the numbers you're sharing, Glenn, glad to hear them, moving from the 30s to almost 60 now and to the 90s next week. Great numbers, glad to hear, and thank you for sharing. I'm going to hand over now to Colleen. Colleen is going to walk us through the Q&A session. So you'd like to take it from here, Colleen?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mrs. Harris-Roper. Thank you, Mr. George, and thank you, Mr. Christian, for those insightful presentations. I can tell from the interaction in the chat that our guests have quite a few questions. So I'm going to take them in the order in which they came. Some of them may have been answered already, but I will ask the attorneys to oblige us with responding, particularly for those people who perhaps came on a bit late and were not able to hear the first part of the presentation. Before we get into the question and answer, though, I just want to indicate to everyone that this session has been recorded and will be shared with everyone who did register for the session, along with the document that was shared before the session as well, the guideline document. All right, so let's head into the question. The first question that came through in the chat was from Camille Reed-Burrell. Her question was, how do we rationalize this advice in the context of the fact that a vaccinated employee can also transmit the virus. Mrs. Roper, I don't know if you want to take that question.
I will leave this one for Mr. George.
Well, I think to be honest, we have to be guided by the medical advice.
Mhm.
And the received medical advice is that although a vaccinated person can contract the virus and pass it on, they are far less likely to catch the virus and pass it on. And therefore, the presence of a vaccinated person in the workplace poses a far lower risk to other employees than the presence of an unvaccinated employee. And on the basis of that medical opinion, I think it's entirely reasonable for us lawyers to say that an unvaccinated person in the workplace poses a problem, which entitles the employer to ask the unvaccinated person if all of the circumstances suggest that there is a risk of transmission because they work together or what have you with other people, then it is entirely reasonable for the employer to say you need to get vaccinated, unless you can come up with some other solution which protects the other employees, like, you know, well, I'm a computer analyst and I can work from home or something to that effect. But once you have to be in the workplace and you're close to other people, the medical opinion is that unvaccinated people pose a much higher risk than vaccinated ones.
I'll add to that, Conrad. Something that I don't think we have gone through here, but worthy of consideration is in terms of reducing that risk, is knowing one's status. And so that puts us in the realm of testing. I remember we had a conversation one time, Conrad, about this whole question of testing. And so 2 avenues I want to look at. The question would be whether or not testing would also be a part of the raft of measures that an employer can use given the nature of the job, who they are dealing with. Because if the risk is not as high, Conrad, then perhaps they can consider looking at trying to keep a tab on the risk of knowing how the person's status in terms of whether or not they are carrying the virus, yes or no, and then be able to use that as part of the management strategy. Now, that is one aspect of it. I see that, I'm not sure who was, I sort of missed, I think it's Mr. Christian, that also said apart from the vaccinations, there's also a regime of testing, if I'm not mistaken. So that also leads us now to another thorny issue of whether or not, having been asked to test, who will pay for it? Who will
And that's
pay
one of the
for it?
questions in the chat, actually. Who pays for that
So
test?
the question now is, it will depend on the direction in which your management decides to go. Because if you have come to the point of saying that, you know, vaccination is where you'd want to be, and you have said, listen, we're giving you the opportunity and we'd like for you to show that you are in fact vaccinated. And I also like the idea of the blitz, but again, I'm being very transparent in my own view. You can't be saying persons are to be vaccinated and then say to them, you find your way to JC, wherever, and show me that you're vaccinated. Part of that has to be working with the relevant authorities to make it available at, within your context. So let's get back to the testing. Who pays for it? I remember when we spoke to Conrad, he used a very colorful example of you being asked to drive a car as a chauffeur, to say, I'm hiring you as a chauffeur, but here what? You not only have to get your own car, but you can put the gas in it and drive it wherever I send you, right? When you get to that point, if it is that you are requesting it, my own view is you are the one that is making this a condition of continued employment. And so that is something that will have to be contemplated either by mutual agreement, say, okay, you have made a choice not to be vaccinated. We are trying to work with you. If you have to take this test, you and I will work out how we are going to pay for it together. Or if you are insistent on that, you make the provisions for the testing, or you move to the next stage, having put everything in place and walk those steps and saying that the risk is too high for me to just allow you to test every 2 weeks, to find an alternative, which is the very last alternative of termination. So that is something, let me be clear. Nothing about this is absolutely certain. It's as clear as mud to some degree, right? And so everybody, the unfortunate thing is that there's a lot of uncertainty, and until we get some case law in, or the government takes the brave, and some people may say foolhardy step to make a legislative provision, we are in the realm that we are trying to give the best guidance we can give, given what we know. And so those are things that have to be contemplated. Take advice in terms of each particular case, what is in the best interest, or given the circumstances, what steps you can take. Conrad, anything to add to that?
I would say just one or two things. I don't entirely agree that it's as clear as mud. I think the principles are very clear, and they've been around for generations. Our own statute law in Jamaica has been with us since the 1970s. So as far as I'm concerned, the principles are clear, they're not complicated. The overriding principle is that all parties in these circumstances must behave reasonably, carefully, having regard to fairness in all the relevant circumstances, both as a matter of common law obligations and as a matter of the statutory principles of justifiable dismissal, etc. So I know that there will be challenges in the courts and in the IDT, and we will have decisions. But I would like to think that the position that we're taking is the correct one, and it will be applied by the courts in due course. Just to follow up on what you said, Carla, about costs, etc., and I would refer the meeting to the steps set out in the protocol. And step 2 in particular, paragraph 17, says, then you need to design a policy that provides the best level of protection from transmission of the virus in the workplace. If the policy requires the use of any equipment or the need to be vaccinated, the employer must provide such equipment and/or arrange vaccinations at his expense, on his time, and at a place convenient to the employees. The employer should discuss all of these matters with all employees with a view to ascertaining any suggestions or objections any might have. The employer should seek to resolve any issues that might arise at this stage. That just underlines the principle that the employer really has to go the extra mile. I don't know how many at the meeting have undertaken redundancy exercises, but although obviously they're different in nature, the manner of approach is quite similar. To conduct consultations in a redundancy exercise requires the employer to sit down with the employees, first of all, each class of employee, and then perhaps individual employees or with the trade unions, etc., and go through all the considerations, listen to all the objections, all of the suggestions, and then, having done all of that, come to a conclusion. And in the final analysis, it's the employer's right to come to the conclusion, because the employer has the right to manage. Provided there are, in law, redundancy situations, and the consultations have been properly documented, when it is challenged subsequently, if it is challenged, the employer will be in a good place. Here, similar considerations apply. Document the thing properly and apply the principles correctly. And so finally, in relation to the question of this testing, now I'm not a doctor, I hear people talking about testing as an alternative, perhaps in certain circumstances, to vaccination. I've also heard doctors say that testing is no substitute because one would have to take so many tests so regularly that it's not a particularly effective substitute. I've heard other doctors suggest that testing may, depending upon the course of the pandemic, become something that is required in addition to vaccination because there may be breakthrough infection which could be picked up by testing. So I don't think that at this stage, any of us really should be thinking in terms of specific lines that one can take in a rigid way. It really has to be addressed from on a case-by-case basis. And above all, nobody should require an employee to pay for a test. That is contrary to the law and could amount to a constructive dismissal, which would end you up in the IDT straight away. So, and Carla mentioned my thing about people requiring a driver to drive to Montego Bay and to deliver a parcel, but he has to pay for the gas. It's an obligation of an employer under the law of employment to reimburse any expense properly incurred by an employee in the course of his employment. And if an employer sends the employee off to go and get a test, obviously that test is a requirement of and done in the course of his employment. The employer has to pay for it unless the employee agrees otherwise.
All right, thank you for that, Mr. George. We're getting a lot of feedback and comments based on what you have shared. And one of the things that is coming out is basically that the vaccination doesn't seem like much of a option for employees. So there's a question saying is the employer liable if the employee gets ill after taking the vaccine?
I don't see any basis upon which that could possibly be the case. On a straight, simple tort law analysis, if I require you to take a vaccination that is something that is promoted by the government, by the Ministry of Health, and God forbid, well, I mean, it's terribly sad, but it's certainly not my liability. It's far too remote.
Okay, and what about, the question has come up now about separating the staff based on who is vaccinated, who is unvaccinated. Is that okay? Is that a principle that companies could look to employ?
Well, I mean, if anybody cares to look at the protocol sets out precisely the circumstances in which that can happen. And if the steps of consultation have reached a stage where there are still some employees who refuse to undertake whatever measures, including possibly vaccination, are required in order for the workplace to be kept safe, and that is a reasonable position for the employer to take in all the circumstances, and an unreasonable position for the employee to take, then the employer can move towards termination of employment. That's set out very clearly in the protocol, and the steps that need to be followed in order to effect that are set out clearly also.
Right. We have a question here from Mr. Guyton Wade, a little different from the others that have come in, but he's asking, are there predetermined business categories that may or may not be mandated to have their staff fully vaccinated? And would such a company, if they provide dental services, for example, be required to mandate staff vaccination?
I would really urge anybody using the word mandate to shift the narrative, because the whole idea of mandating vaccination or any other measure for that matter is not part of our law. Everything has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. Let me give you an example, for instance. You may have a resort property. Now, it is highly likely that any employees who are serving in your restaurant, serving in your bar, cooking in your kitchen at close quarters with others, looking after guests' rooms, etc., need to be vaccinated. And it will be very difficult for an employee to raise an argument to the effect that there's no real risk and no real need for them to be vaccinated. However, that same resort property may have woods that people go riding horses in. And the gentleman who comes in 3 days a week to chop the bush along the path where the horses ride just comes in with his machete chops the bush, and goes back to his yard. And the accountant at the hotel puts the money in his bank account by wire transfer. He doesn't have lunch in any canteen. He doesn't go and meet up with any guests or other workers from the hotel, or he just goes and chops the path 3 times a week so people can ride horses. Now, for a resort business to mandate that all of its employees need to be vaccinated in circumstances where you have such a divergence of actual practical reality, I think is completely averse to what the law is all about and is guaranteed to lead to problems and claims for unjustifiable dismissal. So
that underscores.
In order to stay clear of that, I would urge anybody who is thinking in terms of mandatory vaccination to stop that thought process, look at the protocol which sets out the legal principles and the interplay of those principles, and decide on the basis of those principles what is actually necessary in your circumstances and the circumstances of each of your employees or categories of employees.
Yeah.
It has to
that underscores, Conrad, the necessity for undertaking that risk assessment.
Yes.
It underscores it, and the difficulty we find is that in the cut and thrust of running a business, this is really, sometimes it could be considered, just too difficult and too hard, and just, why do I have to take this time to do this thing? But in these circumstances, it's absolutely necessary if you are going to be seeking to reduce the level of exposure of your business to, adverse claims against you, the organization, if you do not look specifically at what it is they are doing. Let me finish, Conrad. Let me just finish. So to say that because you're working in the tourism industry or at a resort, or that you work in a care home, or if you work in a medical facility, is not to say that every single solitary soul in there needs to have it. The science says that this is the best course of action. But if you take a look at what it is that these persons are doing and the risk of them contracting and sharing, this virus is relatively low given everything else within that. You must act in accordance with that circumstance and not use a broad brush approach. And it takes time, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sorry to say, it takes time.
I would totally agree with that, and just add that is why in the protocol on page, whatever it was again, paragraph 16, that is step 1 that we recommend that everybody undertakes before they do anything else. Assess risk, and that is the wording. It says, what is the risk? Step 1, paragraph 16 of the protocol. That's where you have to start. Otherwise, you run into problems, as Carla is saying, with mandating things across the board. And this is not a case of one size fits all. Every suit of clothes has to be bespoke.
Yes, and especially if persons who may very well be in that risk category have a legitimate reason that related to health, for example, that is properly documented by their medical practitioner, that they may very well, even in their own minds, want to take the vaccine, but it is not recommended based on their personal circumstance. Again, with that assessment, you'll be able to look at what is happening and be able to then act accordingly.
I can add to that also that a medical reason for not taking the vaccination may be a very good reason and a compelling reason in certain circumstances, but perhaps not in others. I'll give you an example. If you have, or two examples, if you have a very large company with multitasking amongst the workforce as a matter of course, and somebody who is performing a particular task has a medical reason for not being able to take the vaccination, you may well be able to fit them in doing something else.
Mhm.
Partially from home, flexi time, job sharing, whatever that may be possible in the context of a large company. But in the context of a company of 5 or 4 or 3, your receptionist, who can do nothing but be your receptionist, has a medical reason for not taking the vaccination. She meets every member of staff that comes in the morning. She meets he meets every customer that comes in during the day, and you have nothing else for that receptionist to do. I would suggest that such an employer has a strong case. If it is frankly impossible to resolve the matter through the person taking a vaccination, it may be justifiable to terminate that person's employment. Now, obviously, in the real world, if one had to do that, one would look at the most painless way of doing it. And I personally would advise such an employer to try to offer the person voluntary redundancy, et cetera, et cetera. But the matter is, the law would view that person's situation differently to the person in the large organization with more flexibility at hand. So, which is why I think it underpins the fact that each case has to be looked at very much on its own merits.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Based on the comments here in the chat, I believe people want to hear a little bit more around the cost. I know you said that, I think you, Mr. George, said that the cost for vaccine, if employers were to request it, the burden should be borne by the employer. There's a question here that came up that said they wanted clarity. If the employee chooses not to be vaccinated and agrees to be tested only for time perpetual, would that testing always be at the cost of the employer?
I'd like to make it very clear that as a matter of law, as it stands today, it is the cost of the employer. If, as a condition of employment, the employer requires the employee to expend money, taking tests or what have you, it's very difficult to argue that that employer is not obliged to pay that cost.
Thank you for that. I have a question in the chat that came from Cherry.
Where you may be able to ameliorate that position, if in the course of your negotiations with the employee, you make it plain, and you are justified in making it plain that you can dismiss that employee because of the refusal to take a vaccination, then it may be possible that you can reach an agreement with the employee as an alternative to dismissal, which you're entitled to do. As an alternative to that, you could agree with the employee, and I think Carla touched on this earlier. You could agree with the employee would pay the cost. But I don't think without such an agreement, without such a circumstance arising, you could mandate that the employee must pay for the test, because that would be policy as an employer, which you are inflicting on the employee. So for it not to be constructive dismissal, you should pay. However, as I say, if you are moving to dismiss, you can agree to anything, including payment by the employee of a test for tests.
All right, and I hope that clears up the questions that we had that our guests have today, our participants. I have a question here from Cherry that I'm actually gonna ask Mr. Distant to take. It's a very interesting question and one that I think that we should respond to. It's saying that are employers incentivized to have their employees vaccinated? And if yes, what is that incentive? Mr. Distant?
So good. Thank you for that question, Sherry. And Claudia, I would say that there is an incentive, and that incentive, I believe, is actually embedded in the guidance in the document. If we take I shouldn't say that's at face value, but the guidance says that as an employer, you have a legal duty to provide a safe system of work, or workplace practices for your employees and your customers. And your failure to have that in place could result in your organization and your company having some legal enforcement against it as a result of not putting the proper controls and policies in place, then for me that's an incentive. So, you know, I believe it may have been Glenn or somebody was talking about the carrot or the stick. I think they didn't really want to talk about the stick, but it's an incentive for me if I know the failure to put policies in place for my business could result in exposure or risk exposure to my business. So if there's a risk, I can find a way to mitigate it. And one of the ways to mitigate it is putting appropriate policies in place. Then I'd say there's something of an incentive for me. Now, how I go about putting that policy in place is a very different conversation. And I believe that that has been very well covered by both Conrad and Carla. So it's not necessarily about not putting something in place, it's about how you go about putting an appropriate policy or measure in place.
Thank you for that response. Cherry, I hope that answers the question that you had. Bridget Husang has a question coming in here. Would it be legal to reduce the working hours or work days for unvaccinated staff? She also adds, is it acceptable going forward to set a company policy where only vaccinated persons are hired? Mrs. Roper?
So let's take the last one, that, you know, if it is, my view in respect of prospective employees, in the same way that you can require that someone gives produces a clean medical record. A clean police record, for example. Whilst it is, unless you are in certain professions or undertaking certain work, that you would be required as a matter of course to advise the employer that you have a spent conviction. Some other persons, because of the nature of what they are doing, would want to have the let's use the word, they want to feel safe, that they don't have someone who has a criminal background coming into their organization, and some places more than others, that they will say this offer of employment is conditional upon us having a clean police record. That is something that routinely happens now, and you know, persons may, if they don't produce that, you know, they may not be able to validly take up an offer that has that condition. At this point in time, because I don't believe we have any general discrimination laws in this country that speak specifically to particulars that, you know, should not be contemplated when you are taking up employment. I do not believe at this time that there is anything to prevent an employer from saying to a prospective employee that this is a condition under which you would have to take a job like this. Now, what it does is put the employee or the prospective employee on notice that this is something that the employer requires. Now, they have the choice to say whether or not, if I want to take this job, this is part of what it is that is required, and I can choose yes or no. Up until now, there is nothing that would prevent the employer from not putting that in place. That's my own personal view. I forgot what the first part of the question was.
Reduction of work hours for people who are unvaccinated. Would that be okay?
Well, again, you go back to what's in your contract of employment. If you have a contract and those persons are available for work, and you have nothing in your contract or rules that gives the employer the power to do that unilaterally, to do so would expose the employer to a possible breach of contract. So if you check your company policy or the employee's contract, and there is an express contractual power that is there that the employee has already agreed to, that allows them to reduce working hours for particular reasons, which could include this, then perhaps the employer can do so without legal exposure. If not, I would strongly recommend that they not operate in that way unilaterally. And perhaps the thing to do would be to have a conversation with the employee in that regard.
Okay, perhaps in the same vein, this question had come earlier from Jennifer. I hope I'm pronouncing her surname correctly. She was asking, would it be legal for an employer to make a list of all the staff and displaying whether or not they are vaccinated with the staff permission, of course? I suppose I'm assuming here, I'm trying to figure out, maybe she means it as an incentive.
I would not recommend that.
Okay.
And that's I don't even know if I'm going to get into law now, because the Data Protection Act, although passed, is not yet enforced. We're talking about persons' medical records, which that is fraught with problems. And I would not recommend any employer do that and put anything on any notice board or intranet, nothing like that. I strongly urge persons not to do that.
Mr. George,
I couldn't agree more. I mean, from a legal point of view, it's potentially very dangerous. But from an HR point of view, I think it's absolutely disastrous. So, you know, that I really would not suggest anybody contemplate seriously.
No. Okay. All right. Well, in the same vein again, Maravia Grant Henry is asking, could we ask the question of vaccination on the employee application form?
Well, I mean, Carla has already answered that, but I'll briefly add this. That's potentially more of a constitutional law issue concerning the Bill of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. But the categories which are protected in the relevant section there do not, in my view, cover anything of that sort. And there is one potential twist to do with religious beliefs, etc. But I don't think that will be construed by a court to have anything to do with religious beliefs that preclude vaccination or anything of that sort. The courts in England and Canada have dealt with those matters in a very narrow way, and the Court of Human Rights, European Court of Human Rights, and our courts tend to follow those very, very closely. So I don't think there's any issue. I don't think it's frankly any different to the operator of a restaurant requiring a food handler's license. If the person does not have a food handler's license and is employed by the restaurateur is going to be in serious problems with his license, with the relevant ministries, Ministry of Tourism, etc., etc. Likewise, an employer who is at risk of liability can justify the requirement of a vaccination certificate for anybody seeking employment. I don't think it's to be viewed in any different way. And the constitutional issues, I don't think, should impinge upon it at all.
All right. We still seem to have a few questions here related to the matter of employer covering the cost for the tests. Still more comments coming in. Yvonne asks, why should the employer have to pay for the test on a weekly basis when the burden of proof is the employees? And a comment I saw earlier was, why is it that the employer would have to pay for the test? If we use the same logic, the employer would be required to pay for the taxi fare for an employee to come to work. So I think we need a little bit more discourse on that aspect of it.
There is a fundamental difference between the cost of coming to work and going home from work and the cost of performing one's duties when one is at work. The cost of going to work and coming from work has never been a cost other than the employee's cost. But once at work, once on the employer's business, the employee, as a matter of common law, is entitled to be reimbursed for any proper expenses incurred. So without anything else being put in place, the employer, if he or she requires of the employee a PCR test or antigen test or whatever kind of test, the employer is obliged to reimburse. And a failure or refusal to reimburse would, in all likelihood, amount to constructive dismissal, because it would be an interference with the employee's entitlements under the contract of employment to be reimbursed.
That's it. It comes, Conrad, to that implied term for the employers to reimburse reasonable expenses, and also the other implied term in the contract for the employee to be ready and available for work. So it is the employee's duty to show up for work and the employer's duty to provide work. So in terms of the taxi fare, I would have to tend to agree with you on that one.
So, but the only way around it is through a careful maneuvering of the situation in the event, as I said earlier, of a falling out after the employer has gone through all the consultation process. At that point, being entitled to dismiss the employee, if in fact that's the situation, there could be a settlement whereby the employee agreed to submit to 72-hour tests or whatever it is that's required and to pay for them. But that's the situation in which you could force it upon the employee and require a deal on that basis. But apart from that, you'd have to ask the employee if he's prepared to hug up the test. The employee says, sure, well, fine. But absent that consent, and Carla mentioned this earlier, absent that agreement, it's the liability of the employer.
Let's look at it another way, Conrad, and this may be a bit controversial. We know that unlike in some other places, because I was in Barbados recently and the cost of the test was a little less than the ones here. But at 22,000, 23,000 a pop, that we have many people that are not earning quite the amount that in, and I'm being very controversial here and decidedly so. It could very well be said that as an action like that could be a shade of duress if that person wants to continue to keep this job, because it is they cannot be able, for the most part, to be footing that bill. So if they want to keep the job, they can contemplate that they're going to take the vaccine because they simply cannot continue to absorb the cost of the test.
Which is why I have always advised people, since this was first arising in March and April of this year, don't go the test route. Go the vaccine route, and to impose tests and pay for them yourself, fine. But the vaccine route is clean, justifiable in most circumstances. You can perhaps supplement it with a test if that's necessary and required by the science. But the vaccinations, mask wearing, etc., are much easier legal options than the test, which is fraught with difficulty because of the cost. And who bears it?
Okay. We're almost at 7:30, so I'm going to take perhaps two more questions that are in the chat. One here is a follow-up pretty much to what we've been discussing here. And it says, if the employer puts the employee on unpaid leave for whatever reason, maybe they don't want to take the test or, they don't want to get vaccinated, what is the statutory limit of time on which the employee can be placed on that unpaid leave?
That's where you're going to stop again.
Straight up.
You're going to stop right there again.
Straight up.
Place employee on unpaid leave. Unless you have a contractual right to do so, right there you're courting disaster by breach of contract by unilateral act. It's that simple. So if your contract created that, fine. Some people use layoffs in terms of disciplinary action, or when they put persons on, they suspend them during the course of a disciplinary hearing. If some persons have put in their contract that the employer reserves the right, if they have put them off, to pay them some or none of their pay during the period. But that is because there is that right that has been accepted and agreed by the employer when they started. Again, I would highly recommend that persons do not go down this route.
Loud and clear. Heard loud and clear.
It's a straight up dismissal.
All right. Well, another question just came in. Can the employer, I guess separate and apart from the test and vaccination, can the employer inquire into the COVID status of their employees?
COVID status, I mean, have you got COVID?
Yes.
I see no reason why not.
Okay. And
In
the,
the
okay.
coming-
Well, if you go further than that, Conrad, if they are exhibiting symptoms, if they have flu-like symptoms and all of that, the DRM says that the employer must take them out of the workplace, put them in an isolation space, send them home, and advise the Ministry of Health. That's the law.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. I mean, you can even require somebody to disclose to you whether they're vaccinated. It's your establishment. You are the employer. You have duties to protect people, and it's established in our law that an employer has the right to ask a question of the employee, and the employee has no right to silence, provided the question is one properly asked in connection with their employment. So there's no way that an employee can refuse to answer questions like that.
All right, this question came in earlier. I think it came in the chat twice. So I really want to address it from Felix White. If a worker by his duties in the office is exposed to catching or exposing other persons to the virus, can the worker claim a religious reason not to take the vaccine? Is there anything in the Charter of Rights that gives them the right to refuse?
My view is that a religious reason is unlikely to hold any water whatsoever. One obviously should listen to it and hear what is said, but the chances of direct instruction from the Almighty or from any of his trilogy is unlikely to be provable. And in the absence of proof, I would suggest that the employer is entitled to say that it's not a good reason.
Okay. This is from Yana Samuels. Can the employer require an employee to use vacation leave to complete quarantine after returning from overseas travel?
Well, that's a question directly on the DRM. And the DRM changes from time to time. I'm prepared to answer that question without looking at the current DRM, which I think came.
All right, and I think this is the final question, Linda. I noticed you posted twice. What if having unvaccinated staff at a resort leads to loss of business? I think we answered this already, but I'll ask it again. For example, more and more guests are making their decision to book a resort based on the level of vaccination of the staff. Can the employer in those instances mandate vaccination? We spoke about the word mandate already, but Mr. George?
That's the problem with the word mandate.
Yeah.
And it is problematic. It doesn't work in our system of law. Obviously, it is of vital importance for the operator of a hotel or any other resort establishment to make the place as safe as possible. And frankly, in practical terms, I can't foresee too many instances where vaccination will not be required. But it's not something that you can just mandate because it's a resort enterprise. You have to look at the nature of the resort enterprise and deal with it accordingly. But in practical terms, yes, I don't see any basis for suggesting that any significant number of resort employees can say that they don't need to be vaccinated in order for the place to be safe. What I would add to that is, although obviously the commercial imperatives are very important, and that's how businesses are run, and as you point out, a large number of guests are now, or potential guests are inquiring before they book whether all the staff are vaccinated. That's highly relevant to the way one runs one's business. But from a technical legal point of view, it's not something that I would want to put up front and center because it's subjective. It's one of the factors perhaps, but the really important factors from a legal point of view are the more objective factors. So that can be fed in. It's relevant. It's from a business point of view, it's imperative. Mm-hmm. But from a legal point of view, I think one should be very careful to focus on the issues that have been outlined in the protocol, which are those that are recognized by the law.
Thank you so much.
Conrad, one question that, and I'm throwing this for you, And if you don't want to answer, I can understand. But it's something that has been said, and I have thought about it myself. I haven't really come to any particular conclusion, although I have some thoughts. So you, as the employer, have a duty to ensure that your staff, as far as is possible, is able to help by virtue of their actions to meet the occupational safety and health requirements in terms of vaccination. But what of the customer? In some places in the States, I have seen what has started happening is that, for example, restaurants, persons are asked to disclose their vaccination status before they are allowed entry. So we can end up doing all of this in terms of trying to ensure as far as is possible that between staff members, you reduce that risk of exposure to the employer to this duty. But how or what should, if anything, should an employer do in terms of customers that can come in, interact with your staff that you have done almost everything to protect, and don't expose them?
Well, I think the same law applies. You, as an employer, have a duty to keep your staff safe, your customers safe, and any other members of the public who might interact with your business. And that includes very much so whom you allow into the building or onto the premises or to interact with your staff. So absolutely, it applies equally to allowing people into the premises or onto the premises or to have contact with your staff who are unvaccinated.
So, but can you not see, and I'm being devil's advocate here, that the high likelihood is that, the kind of strictures that are taken internally are not necessarily going to be taken for those externally?
Well, I have had to do with some protocols recently, which require any customers to disclose their vaccination status. And depending upon what their status is, they are dealt with differently. They have to deal with off-site, by Zoom, or what have you, if they're unvaccinated. If they're vaccinated, then they can come into the office or come into the factory. So that is something that a number of employers in Jamaica are already considering.
And so therefore, we should throw that out in this forum, that employers should appreciate that the actions that they may or may not take for their employees, which may be able to assist them in dealing with an internal threat, a thought may necessarily have to be had with reducing the risk from an external source, from customers and other clients.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's very much part of it. I mean, this protocol really has been entirely tailored to deal with relations between employers and employees. And so for that reason, I suppose it's not something that we've dealt with. But from the point of view of an overall protocol within a business, a particular
and the duty,
and the duties that are involved, those are pretty well the same. And should be dealt with accordingly. Obviously, from a commercial point of view, it has to be done very delicately because you don't want to turn away business and lose revenue. But equally, there are legal duties, and there are diplomatic ways around.
I just thought I'd throw that in so that we don't. Whilst it is that you had raised that issue from the tort level about the remoteness and the nexus, so you have to be able to tie the link if it is that is going to be actionable. But nevertheless, it's also important to contemplate and to look to see how best you can reduce that risk. So the same kinds of approaches that you have internally, that you are saying to persons wear their masks and wear their whatever, when the persons come into your store, ensure that the persons are coming in, that they stop at the door, take temperature, wear masks, sanitize, and try as best as possible to keep the social distancing. So those are things that can be done along with, I suppose, a contemplation of how to deal with the vaccine elephant in the room as it relates to persons who don't work for you, but must interact with your staff.
I saw a picture of President Bolsonaro of Brazil eating a pizza on a sidewalk in New York this afternoon because he is unvaccinated, and none of the good restaurants in New York allow any unvaccinated people in. So he and his crew are out on the sidewalk.
Whoa. Oh, I mean, one can picture that.
We just might get there, and these conversations will be almost moot because everybody will be getting vaccinated. All right, we've had quite a fulsome discourse this evening. Thank you so much, attorneys at law, for joining us this evening, Mr. George and Mrs. Harris Roper. I'm going to invite the president of the Jamaica Employees Federation, Mr. David Wan, if you're still on, to just share a few words with us before I hand over to Mr. Distant, Lloyd, to do the closing remarks for this evening. Mr. Wan?
Yeah, good evening, everyone, participants, panelists, everybody. We are quite happy to see the turnout in today's forum. I think it will be it's a useful addition to the document we sent out already to our membership about the recommended protocols. And I think it will give a lot of guidance. And I remember one participant said, I think Mr. Christian, in the absence of any legislation or regulations by the government, something is needed to guide employers around this topic. So I'm glad that the group of us, the JCC, JEF, PSOJ, and the trade unions were able to provide this for employers to give some level of guidance. So thanks to the participants and the presenters from JEF. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wan. And Lloyd, just before I hand over to you, I want to acknowledge the president of the PSOJ as well, and just invite Mr. Duncan to share a few words with us as well. Keith?
I wasn't expecting that, Lolene, but thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Carla-Anne, for participating and driving this effort. Mr. Distant, we know that you had the legs and regs to drive this, and thank you very much for leading this effort. And for Imega and team and Lolene for the work done in terms of pulling this all together. So we really do appreciate the effort. We think we need to give guidance to the sector, to employees, to and the unions being involved in this was very, very important. And I believe that social partnerships are the way to go. And this is an example of a social partnership. So again, I'd like to just thank everyone for their participation, and thank you, Mr. Distant, for leading this process. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Keith. So Lloyd, finally, I'm handing over to you.
I'm looking closely to see if Helen Davis White is on as well, to invite her to say a few words.
I was searching, I didn't see her.
Claudine, thank you for taking us through the Q&A. Friends, members, an inherent component. We start a lot of this conversation starts from this premise about mandating vaccines, and I believe, as Conrad and Carla have said on several occasions, let's get away from using that word mandate and speak about what it is that you need to put in place to protect your businesses, protect your employees, and protect your customers. Inherently, that's what this document, the document that was circulated, is all about. It's understanding the responsibility and duty that we have as business owners, business leaders, to the stakeholders with which we engage and provide services to and for. And as a result of that, as we look at the context of how we implement or put in place such policies, the example that was shared by Glenn, which pulls a lot of the best practices that were mentioned in the document, ensuring consultation again, speak about what you plan to do, and then ensuring consultation once again, is one of the most important components of what we can encourage you to do. The exposure to our businesses are real. How we choose to attend to them, each of us will have to look internally to our organization and our operations and decide from that, or determine from that, what is absolutely necessary for our business versus what is a nice to do, a good to have. I encourage, take a look at the document. You have further questions, you can send those questions to the secretariat of any one of the business support organizations, the JEF, PSOJ, JMEA, or the JCC. We'll ensure that we get them filtered, help to get your responses or guidance. I won't say that we have a lot more free work to get from Conrad and Carla. They're quite expensive resources, so we're very pleased that they were able to actually provide this initial guidance and to continue to come with us to engage and share of their knowledge and perspective. Conrad and Carla, one of the things, as we were getting ready to wrap up, it dawned on me just how unambiguous you both have been in your views and thoughts on this. And I believe in a time when we are all embattled with several perspectives from friends overseas, gut reactions because we believe that we must do what we want because it's our business. It's always good to have the rational, logical thought process that you brought to this, and of course the unequivocal and unambiguous clarity that you provided about what it is we can or can't do, and the likely repercussions if we don't follow this process. Again, thank you, Conrad. Thank you, Carla. Very much appreciate all you've done and the support you have given. I'll close it off there. As I said before, we continue to provide support as more clarity comes, as government may choose to put legislations in place, either through OSHA or some other means. We certainly will continue to communicate and share that guidance with yourselves as well. Again, thank you all, and look forward to us finding our own path through this, continue to find our own path through this challenging time of COVID-19. Okay, thank you all.